So really quick, a quick introduction about our next speaker and our second keynote and last keynote for today. We have Sargun Kaur. She is the CEO and co-founder of Byteboard, a technical interview platform that has redesigned technical interviews and to be more reflective of what engineers do on the job through a project-based approach. Prior to starting Byteboard, Sargun was a software engineer at Google Photos team. And Sargun is also Forbes 30 Under 30 Honoree Class of 2020. So please welcome Sargun Kaur.
Thank you so much. I'm super excited to be here today. For quick background, my sisters actually went to San Jose State. So really awesome program that y'all have, because I've kind of seen my sisters go through it personally. So that's been awesome. But today I'm going to be really focusing on talking about going 0 to 1, turning an idea into a startup. I've been working on my first startup for the last 3 years called Byteboard, and it's been a super exciting journey, but I can say now 3 years from there that I had no idea what I was getting into. And it really started with, just a small idea. And now 3 years later, we've gone through so much that I love talking about, all the highs and the lows that we've gone through it. So I hope to share some of that with y'all today to hopefully ignite some of that entrepreneurship and give you a glimpse into what your future might look like if you do have an idea that you convert into thinking about building a startup out of it. So quick background on myself. I studied computer science at UC Berkeley. I will say that computer science wasn't my favorite thing or my first choice by any means, which is tough to say in this crowd, but it was something that I figured that if I pursued computer science, I could kind of go into any route possible, because so much of tech touches everything that we do, from everything from the NBA have, the NBA teams have like data analysts and machine learning specialists on their teams, on their back end teams, to like things that I'm building today in terms of improving engineering interviews and social impact work have computer science tied into it. So that was the reason I got into computer science. And eventually ended up being an engineer at Google on the Google Maps team, and then eventually on the Google Photos teams. Learned a ton. I will say school was nothing like what working on the job was. If you have questions on what working at Google is like, happy to answer those afterwards as well. But those were really the years that I learned how to be a computer scientist or computer software engineer. And those things aren't always shown to you or taught to you in school. So it was really great opportunity for me to understand, like specifically on the Google Photos team. I joined that team pretty early on, and if you're familiar with that product, it's one of my favorite Google products, not just because I built some of the features or was on the team, it was because it felt very much like working on a startup inside of Google. We were a small team of about 30 to 40 people that were building up features and really talking directly to users. And I think that was my first kind of purview into what it takes to take a small idea and then like really see it grow to 1 billion users. And then eventually the idea of Byteboard honestly really came to be. My co-founder and I, Nikki, who also worked at Google, I ran into her at Google. We started talking, we started venting about the interview process. I'm sure some of you all have perhaps done intern interviews or other software engineering interviews that you're pretty familiar with. It's not a fun process. I wish it was. And we're trying to make it a little bit more fun, but we were venting about the process and ended up just spending like a couple of hours together, started researching and realized like there's got to be something better that has to be built. And that's really the origin story of Byteboard, was our venting session. Ended up pitching it, got funding for Byteboard through Google, and I've been working on that full time for the last 3 years. So that's a little bit about myself. A little bit about Byteboard. I know in the intro, y'all heard what Byteboard's working on, but byteboard.dev to learn a little bit more. But this really came from a personal pain point, and I mentioned that because that's where I think where a lot of great ideas turn into startups. You need to have so much passion for what you work on, because you're about to sign up your life and you don't even know it to this project, to this startup. It's something that I think about all day, every day, go to sleep worrying about it, wake up thinking about like all the 10 things I have to do about it. So if you don't have a personal kind of passion for it or the idea, it makes it a lot harder to work on. And working on in entrepreneurship, I think there was a tweet I read recently that said, starting a company is something I would only recommend to my deepest enemies, which I found really funny, just because to give you an idea of like often what it's like when you kind of embrace an idea and really put in a commitment to work on it. It kind of takes over your entire life, in good ways and bad ways. And so with Byteboard, it's something that I've had the privilege of working on for the last couple of years, and it's helping improve interviews to be more reflective of what engineers do on the job. It's helping change how underrepresented groups get hired in the industry, particularly thinking and talking about traditional interviews tend to over-index on algorithms, data structures, which tend to really help folks that have the time and resources to prepare, who know that they should go to cracking the coding interview and do that book cover to cover, which is what I did. But not everyone has those resources to prepare, but that doesn't mean that they're not great engineers. They're just not passing the interview. And that was really the goal with Byteboard, to really help expand how we look and assess for talent. And we've had some great companies been using Byteboard, from Robinhood to Lyft. So if you ever end up interviewing out with some of these companies, you might get to see that exercise on your own, which would be really cool. But getting into the core topic of today, I think potentially also just being in the Bay Area my entire life, you know, I've always come across conversations with friends, with myself. I'm just like, oh, that would be a cool idea. Or always taking a problem and thinking about like, how can I make this a startup? How can I make this an app? To a degree that's probably a little bit too annoying to some of my friends, and particularly my parents. Like, not everything has to be an app, not everything has to be a startup. But there's this conversation that you constantly have with your friends or whoever, like, hey, like we should build this or we should do this. And I found this quote to be really funny and particularly poignant, saying, in trial and error, succeed over the planning of the lone genius. And in the sense that initially when I had ideas before Byteboard, I'd want everything to be perfect. I'd be like, here's the name. I need to first figure out the name, then I need to figure out the website. I need to build out all these features to really actually produce this for the world. And what I learned with building Byteboard in the last 3 years is actually that's like completely the wrong way to think about things, or how to go about building things. You don't have to have it perfect from the get-go. You don't need to have every feature, and you really shouldn't have every feature from the start. You should really be focusing on building your MVP, and solving a real problem in a way that's completely functional, that's delightful, and eventually scalable. And that's really what I'm going to center our talk about today. So this is a quick snapshot of what the early stage of Byteboard looked like. This is when we were initially just like figuring out the idea. And so we did a bunch of research studies. We talked to a number of folks, a number of engineers on what does it mean to be a great software engineer. Took that research and brought it to the whiteboard to figure things out. You'll see like this right here is like the antithesis of like what the interview looks like today. We pulled all this research together to build our product right now, but it was so scrappy in the beginning, and it involved really talking to people, getting down and dirty, and figuring things out versus like planning it all out in your head, and thinking that you can execute it perfectly, and that's how startups run. I know like billion-dollar startups, unicorn startups that are working on things that are completely scrappy, completely like on the back end, just kind of put together because you're learning as you go, and there's so much trial and error that goes into building on your idea to eventually land to something that will actually work. So today I'm going to talk about 3 particular points. Validating your MVP. MVP stands for minimal viable product, something you might have heard about before, but we'll talk about it a little bit more today. 2, in addition to focusing on the product, also focusing on your team, and a lot of lessons I learned there, particularly by trial and fire. And then how do you take both the product and a good team, and how do you scale that to build out your idea from 0 to 1. So starting with your MVP, it really comes down to solving a real problem. And what I was mentioning earlier about like having an idea that's a personal pain point, that's why like you already have an investment in knowing like what's the pain point of what I felt, and that's why I have this idea and wanting to really solve a real problem. One of the things I find pretty often in the industry or with ideas is you start with like this awesome idea for an app or or building something, and then try to like figure out what problem it can solve. And that doesn't always, that's not something I would recommend, or that's not the way I would recommend like starting out on an idea. You really want to start from a problem and then think about a solution that fits that problem versus the other way around. And so what is an MVP? I think oftentimes there's a confusion of like, what are all of the things that kind of contribute to building out an MVP? Wikipedia would define it as a version of a product that has just enough features to satisfy early customers. I don't love this definition particularly because this concept of features and feature creep is something that's pretty common in the industry of like, that becomes very unruly very quickly. MVP does not mean features. It actually means like what value you can deliver for your product, for your early customers, to really validate that your idea has legging, has footing in the real world. I found this craft to actually be a lot more reasonable into understanding what an MVP is. So you look at this pyramid that has a group of, that's grouped by values, benefits, and features. Features are really like the extra furnishing, the extra like cherry on top to merely make things function beyond the value that you've already delivered. So
Hi, sorry, Sargun.
Yeah.
I don't think you're presenting. Do you mind trying to present one more time, like sharing and unsharing your screen? Because we're still on the slide that says going 0 to 1.
Oh no. Is it sharing now?
Yes, perfect. You're on the screen.
Oh no, I'm so sorry.
That's no problem.
Well, you missed all the fun slides. But hopefully you can see this pyramid now. We're seeing value, benefits, and features. And in terms of what a real MVP is, I would say it's like largely delivering on the values, on like how can I validate this problem or this problem statement and the value proposition that I'm adding to my MVP. It's not about how can I capture the most features or functionalities. I think a lot of time it's really exciting to think about an idea and be like, oh, then I can add this and then I can do this. But that makes the idea a lot bigger, and it's always better to validate with the core subset of what you're trying to solve for. So as I said, MVP equals value, and particularly value doesn't need to be pretty. And what I mean by that is, looking at Byteboard as an example, our core value was to create interviews that fairly assess for the right skills. There's nothing in here about them having to be like an exceptional UI or, candidates being able to like get feedback or like all of these other features that we have now today. When you look at the core value of it, it was to deliver interviews that were fair and assess for the right skills. And the way that we did that initially, actually, for the first 6 months of building this, we barely wrote a single line of code. We actually leveraged email, Google Docs, and zip files. And what I mean by that is we literally wrote down an interview question on a Google Doc. We would email it to candidates and then have them email back a zip file with code. And that's what the Byteboard interview used to look like in the beginning. But that helped us validate our initial MVP or our value prop to understand, hey, does that core interview that we've put together, is that actually assessing for the right skills? Once we were able to validate that and answer yes or no, that's working, then we built out a platform that had all of those features and extra bells and whistles attached to it. But we felt a lot better about investing in those resources to build out a full platform when we knew the value prop was there and validated. Hope that makes sense. So initially, when we were going out to customers, particularly at Lyft, they were really skeptical of this idea. So we don't want to be investing in something that they were already skeptical in. We wanted to build something that was initially really just got to the point, and then we could validate with our early customers of if this was working or not. So we found a way to solve for something that was a real problem in a way that was a super scrappy product. And that's probably your like ideal kind of mix of things of wanting to solve and find an understanding of, does your idea work before you've invested too many resources in it? And I bring out this this point about a scrappy product. What I mean by scrappy is it's literally like glued and taped together in a physical sense. And that example of like using Google Docs and a zip file and things like that is an example of like, we literally use existing, APIs and existing infrastructure to kind of wobbly put together our product to really validate and see like, does this work or not? And so when you're thinking about any idea, see what's out there first that you could kind of leverage together to get like an initial introduction or like a loose idea of what that real product might look like, just to go out and validate. And we follow this I find this to be like a good example of like the cycle that you want to follow. You build some stuff, you go out and answer and validate, does this work really? And then you learn based on those assumptions and you continue to go on this cycle. And that's really what ends up going from 0 to 1. Like that's the kind of the large antithesis to, what building a startup really feels like. I've made so many mistakes along the way. We've like added features, we've pulled that back. We've, introduced pricing that's like worked well and not worked well, but we've really just like built something that's scrappy first, gone out to validate it, and then like continued on this circle. And eventually 3 years will pass by and you'll realize, oh shoot, I have a whole team and a startup to manage with a blink of an eye. So I found this image to be like such a perfect example of what a startup feels like and oftentimes like on the surface versus what's on underneath. And this is an example for even much bigger startups than Byteboard. I've had like the chance to talk to a lot of founders and see what it's like, but it doesn't have to always, function on the back end perfectly. You really just want to make sure that you're on the surface, it's working and operating as you expect for your customers. They're getting the value at it. And however you do it on the back end, oftentimes kind of feels like, you're just learning, you're being very scrappy again, or you're pulling things together. But this is a really great example of, okay, we're looking at this functionality. Folks pick up a ticket and then they drop it back in. Okay, that seems to be working. Now we can automate it. A really good company example of this is actually Airbnb, and I'd highly recommend y'all listen to the podcast by Reid Hoffman, where he interviews Brian Chesky on how they went about building Airbnb. But Airbnb's like literal philosophy in the beginning was to build a company that wasn't scalable, and they manually like went out and would like sign up listings on a spreadsheet and then like get a photographer to go and capture photos of that listing. And like until that point where that like almost became unfunctionable for a single human to do, that's when they automated it. But the beauty of that was that they got to like really interact with the customers and see like what were the pain points that the customer had, and build a product. Eventually, once they started to build out a whole platform for it, really build a product that answered directly to the user needs. If you start to pull back and start automating things or building out all your features too soon, you end up in a situation where you might be too removed from your end users that could impact your product in many ways. And that's some of the lessons I've learned there too. 2, investing in your team. This is something that, often is a second thought to like building your idea or building your product, but it's such a big thing about having a successful startup. So really quick pop quiz, something I guess y'all could kind of think about on your own is, how many new startups do you think were in the US this year, or actually this is information on last year? And how much VC funding do you think these startups have raised? Okay, I assume it's a lot. The number's pretty big. It's upwards of $10 billion across a number of deals. And so money is clearly not the problem. But when you look at the top 2 reasons startups fail, it's actually team is a big component of that. And I've seen that so much, especially having gone through an incubator program myself. We started off with 11 teams, and if your team is not on the right page, or if you're basically getting into a relationship, I often say, like, I'm in a somewhat of a marriage with my co-founder where we always have to be in sync. We always have to be talking about the future. We always have to be on the right path, because you're making so many decisions that can impact your product, your future together. And if you don't have the right synergy with your team, that can really impact your future. Particularly some of the steps that we took as a team was to really focus on understanding, each other's conversation habits. How do we like to receive feedback? What are our strengths? What are our weaknesses? And how do we divvy up work? Inevitably, there's ego involved in startups. There's so much like other outside forces that come into it. How do you handle that change? How do you handle those kind of critical conversations? Leads to understanding if you're going to have a strong culture or something that's going to end up breaking apart your startup or your idea. And that's the reason I really do bring this up in this conversation of when you're thinking about building something from 0 to 1, team is a big part to consider. I really like this diagram, and clearly I have a thing for pyramids apparently, but this is something that we talk a lot about on our team. It's the 5 dysfunctions of a team. And when you look at what's inside the pyramid, so it starts from absence of trust, which leads to fear of conflict, which leads to lack of commitment, which leads to avoidance of accountability. And then lastly, it leads to inattention to results, which is something that would be basically kind of like a death to an idea or a death to a startup if you're not actually like hyper vigilant of the details or focused on the results of your startup. That can kind of deteriorate what you're building. And there's a lot of reasons that those things can be introduced in your team. And that's what you see on the right hand of this pyramid of, of something that's like, you're not able to be vulnerable with your teammates or your co-founder, can lead to an absence of trust. If you never feel confident enough like to raise something that's critical or disagreeing with your team, that can lead to a fear of conflict. So you lead up to these things that can be very, very detrimental to your team. And I think this quote really brings it together in a sense that coming together is the beginning, keeping together is progress, but working together is success. Super cheesy quote, but I will say that it really does get to what it feels like to build a startup. We've had folks on my team that have, I've made bad hires, I've had to fire because they were detrimental to our team culture. It led to like our team not feeling comfortable or psychologically safe on our team because of these individuals being present. And that's when it's super toxic to your culture, and it's also impacting your product. And to give you a preview on what it feels like to be a founder, particularly handling all these things. You've probably heard of there's an engineering team, there's a product team, there's a sales team, but as a founder or founding team, you're actually handling kind of all of these things all at the same time, which can make things feel a little bit overwhelming. But that's something to keep in mind when you're starting out on an idea and building out your team, or like, what are my strengths? How am I going to manage this? How am I going to build this? And finding really, really strong people around you and building your team with really, really exceptional people that you can trust, because you can't handle it all. And there's a lot of responsibility as a founder that you take on. I suppose you can all ask parents or caretakers. It probably feels very similar. And this brings me to my last point of making things scalable. When it comes to scaling, and that's kind of the part that we're at right now as a team and a product, you want to continue to keep your eyes set on the pain for the user and not get too far away from the user, where you want to balance out both what you've been working on at present to solve for the user, but also then start thinking about your vision of in the future, how can I make things better? How can I add things to my product or even my team that they might not be experiencing right now, but they will in the future. And that's kind of the murky balance of like both maintaining your quality of service right now, but also starting to add and think about things and how you can improve things in the future. But you want to make sure that you really get the now right before you start thinking about the future. And the question that brings up is like, okay, like everything's working now. What if your dreams come true tomorrow? What happens then? Like everything's working. What happens tomorrow? And so then these are just examples of what I've put up. Like, hey, we want to do international support. We want to add more, features. We want to improve our team processes. There's like a Pandora's box of things that opens up. But that's where, okay, I'm ready to grow now. I'm ready to scale both my product and my team, but you need to have a solid foundation first. And lastly, like focusing on the pain is something that's like always that relates back to your core values, really important. It's something that, feature creep happens very suddenly, and it's like, oh, like this feature idea I have, like, it's going to be great. Like we should really make it work. And like very quickly that like cannibalizes into something that's like unmaintainable, and you always have to bring it back. And something that I often forget too, because I get so excited, I'm like, why aren't we building this, or why aren't we adding more people here or there? It's important to remember to like focus on the user pain, not about your own ideas, or getting lost in this like imaginary world of like, oh, we can add this and this and this, and those things might not relate back to the user. And to have that really tight feedback loop from the user to the product, from your team to the CEO, or from the team to the founder is really important. I'd leave you all with this exceptional chart, which kind of like gets to what it feels like to building things from 0 to 1, where you start out with this idea and you're like, oh, like this is brilliant. This is going to be like a game changer and it's going to be so much fun. And then you start looking into it where you're like, oh shoot, like this is so hard. It's going to take a lot of work, and you kind of hit this despair point, which happens quite often. I would say I go through these cycles pretty often as these ideas come and go. But you hit this despair point, and then afterwards, you kind of go through it. And if you land on something that's like really works, there's this like immense feeling of like, holy shit, you've built something great. It's working. It's having impact. And I think that's a feeling that like keeps me going and keeps me like super excited about building, and definitely has gotten me like the startup bug, having worked on like a company like Google, and going from Google to startup is like a huge change. But I don't think I would like ever go back to working on a big company now, because this feeling is so tremendous to see something that like was this like completely like in the wind idea to being like a tactical product at the end of the day. So with that, hopefully you all learned something about going from 0 to 1. If you have questions.
Wow, I think as engineering students, a lot of us have ideas we want to implement, and understanding and taking us through your journey specifically, and the tips that you've shared with us today has truly inspired us, especially me, to take the leap. Now we'll go over a few questions we have prepared for you before opening it up to the audience. Audience, feel free to type some questions in the chat, whatever you guys want to ask Sargun. We have a good amount of time. So to begin with, I think you kind of touched on it, but what was your real inspiration that drove you to actually start Byteboard?
Yeah, so Nikki and I, my co-founder and I, we honestly, this is the story I was telling, was like, hey, I've been through interview processes myself a number of times to end up at Google, gone through interviews a lot. And it was like a whole separate process to study for interviews. And after I got the job, what I was doing on the job felt so different than what I had to prepare for, in the sense that, even as a Google engineer, I would be like looking up stuff. I'd be talking to people to get to the right solution. I wasn't like reciting algorithms from memory to like make things work. Mm-hmm. And that felt like completely different than what my interview experience was like. And that's really where the idea for Byteboard came to be, of like, how do we build an interview that actually gets to quote unquote more bites of a person than a whiteboard interview allows, and actually kind of feels very reflective of what you'd be doing on the job.
That makes a lot more sense. And I think you kind of mentioned a few things about your co-founder. So we understand that, as you mentioned, that finding a co-founder is really important aspect of, building a startup. So what qualities do you believe that a co-founder should exhibit?
I think having exceptional trust is so important. Your co-founder doesn't need to be your best friend or anything like that. Actually, I'd recommend you become friends after you become a co-founder versus the other way around, just because it allows for you to feel a little bit more free, like mentioning things and saying things in a way that if you were already friends before, it sometimes leads to this relationship where you're like too trepid to say anything. So in terms of qualities in a co-founder, I think there's also like looking at complementary skills, right? Like if you're both good at the same skills, it can also create conflict in a sense of like, what is our role? What do we do? But with Nikki and I, we had a lot of complementary skills. We also had a lot of skills that were similar, but there's it allowed us to like really scope out the level of work that each of us were going to handle. And at the end of the day, to be able to communicate and like really feel like, hey, we're at the foundation level where we both have the same mission in mind and are aligned on that. And then we can trust each other to make those decisions is really important.
I think all of those things that you mentioned are super important. I think something that you mentioned and what I've read upon about your past and your history is you are a first-time founder. This is your first startup. So what are some experiences and lessons you have learned along the way as a first-time founder?
I think one of the most surprising things that I've learned as a first-time founder is like how much personal impact it's had on me. I remember friends of mine being like, wow, like you've changed so much since you founded your company. And in a sense it has, because it's like allowed me to gain a lot of confidence and like get to feedback faster or just understand what are my weaknesses. Mm-hmm. I remember initially between Nikki and I, my co-founder, I'm someone who's, this is somewhat personal, like I'm someone who's like very avoidant when it comes to conflict, or I was initially. So like something would come up when it was just Nikki and I, even when we brought on our first hire, I'd like kind of shut down or like not talk about it because I'd like want to figure out how to resolve it on my own. But Nikki's someone that's the opposite, who wants to ask and like be like, what's wrong? What's happening? And that was creating like conflict between us, and like because we weren't able to come together to talk about things. And once we realized like that's something that was, something of a personality trait, we were able to call it out and actually like have a conversation around it, such that now like the first person to go to is Nikki. It was like, hey, like this is what's happening. I need some time to think about it on my own, and we'll come back to it and talk about it together. So there's like this like insurmountable amount of like personal growth that you go through as a founder. And the surprising parts of it are everything from personal growth, but also all the things that you're going to have to manage. And sometimes that feels like, I wish I knew what I was getting into before I got into it. Not that I have any regrets, just felt like I wish I had a little bit more of an idea what we were walking into.
I think that, as you mentioned, with your journey and all the lessons you've learned, and as a female in engineering, you have the Forbes 30 under 30 title, all the accomplishments you have made along the way. You serve as an inspiration for many women in tech as well. So what advice do you have for the future female engineers who feel as if they don't really belong in the industry?
Yeah, it's a question that I get a lot. Now more often than not, I talk about my journey as an entrepreneur. But initially, when I was an engineer, a lot of what I used to talk about with folks was a considerable amount of imposter syndrome that I faced. And that's not because like, I know imposter syndrome is like pretty talked about, but I literally hated my experience in computer science academically. It was not something that was inviting. It was not something that I like particularly loved or was working on in a space that with people that looked like me. I would say like over 70-80% of my class was male or non-female. And so that led to just feeling like inadequate in many ways of like wanting to do something that was actually impactful. And it wasn't actually like, and then like going to Google and working with like intensely talented folks also doesn't quite help that fact. But eventually what made me realize, or has been super inspirational as a female engineer for me, is just like being around other female engineers and like who've been very open of like, oh yeah, like I had like 30 comments on this, like this change list that I just cut it up. And I'm like, oh, cool. Like I also had like so many comments on the code I just submitted. Like that's totally normal. And to like really normalize like the things that we encounter every day. There's been like, I think particularly I landed on a really good team that was like, there is no dumb question, like feel free to ask. And like, I learned so much on that team and like really had some really solid mentors. And to see that happen and like, I want it to be completely normal and not have to call myself a female founder, right? Like I want to be just a founder. I don't want to eventually like end up being a female founder or be a part of a statistic. But unfortunately, there's like so much out there that leads to privileges to folks that are not female, or that might be that might look like the majority representation, because there's the folks who get the funding. They're the folks that have the time to build out ideas. You know, it's a process that lends to a specific group, and it's really about like breaking out of it and realizing, hey, we need to support each other into getting more folks that are female, that are underrepresented into these spaces.
Wow, yeah, I think as I know a female myself, and I know there's quite a few females in the audience, I think that was really helpful to hear. And a final question that we've prepared, and then we can open it up to the audience that Nanar is going to be moderating, is you mentioned a little bit about funding in your previous question, but in the initial stages of forming your startup, what techniques did you implement to receive funding?
Yeah, we're in a bit of a special case. So we're funded through Google's internal incubator called Area 120. That's how our initial round of funding came to be. And it really, one of the big things actually I learned, and this relates back to this question, is so much of building a startup is about storytelling. It's if you can tell the story and convince someone, you're golden, right? Like you sometimes see these like absurd startups that like have zero revenue, but like have raised so much money. And it kind of lends back to a number of things, but a part of it is exceptional storytelling. And so much of my job today is storytelling to recruit people onto my team. It's storytelling to get investors to put in more money. It's storytelling to get our team excited about the next vision, about the next product. So all of it is like really getting getting someone like to really be convinced of like there's potential here. And that's really the name of the game when it kind of came to fundraising initially, particularly when we had just an idea and no product. The way that we put together our pitch deck was we had a lot of research of folks saying like, we hated the interview process, or this is our experience with the interview process. We had statistics to back that up. And then we had our personal experience to it. We had no idea what the product was going to look like when we went out to get funding. We just had a really clear delineation of what the problem looked like. And that's how our initial round of funding came to be.
Oh, wow, that's definitely an interesting approach. Now, Nanar, I'd like to invite you to ask questions from the audience that we've collected.
Hi. I just wanted to say thank you so much for speaking today. I know that I was really looking forward to this talk and it was super motivational. We just have a couple of questions from the chat. The first is from Anna. She says, how did you go about testing your MVP and finding companies to use your product?
Yeah, that's a good question. So when we initially started to build out our MVP, we were already talking to a number of engineers at different companies, but our initial pilot was actually a friend of mine was an engineering manager at Lyft. I messaged her, told her what I was working on. She's like, yeah, this is a problem I run into a lot. Let's talk about it. She brought me to Lyft campus. We started talking about the idea and she's like, okay, this is a problem I identify with. I trust you because I know you, like, let's do a pilot. And it literally started from like just reaching out and asking folks like, hey, who feels this pain point and would you be interested in a pilot? We were super lucky that Lyft, being a brand name, was an initial pilot member, and our pilot ended up going really well and things really started to grow from there. But I've seen folks, depending on what product you have, like testing at like the Starbucks on the corner, because they know that's where their target demographic is going to come, and just start talking there, and things grow pretty rapidly from there.
Awesome. Okay. Next we have Alexander and Hayden. Their questions kind of work hand in hand. Alexander asks, since you're a proponent of the MVP route, how long would you spend brainstorming on a startup, since you're worrying less about features? And then Hayden kind of ties into that. How thoroughly developed was Byteboard before bringing it into reality?
Yeah, in terms of like being a proponent of the MVP route, it's kind of like goes back to that. And again, I'm so sorry about my slides not being shared earlier. I don't remember when I started sharing, but it kind of goes back to this circle of like, there's no point where you're like, okay, like I am done with the MVP, now I'm building out it kind of is just so gradual as you build on things, right? When we initially started, again, forgot what slide I started sharing on, but when we initially started with just our email and a Google Doc, right? Like we started to automate parts of it that were easier to automate and like really grow out of our MVP there. It's 3 years later now that we're actually going off of Google Docs. We started embedding Google Docs in our platform, but now we're building our entirely own brand new kind of like Docs version, but that's 3 years down the line. So you're constantly iterating on what your MVP looks like based on the feedback that you receive. There was components of this based on our pilot with Lyft that we changed, like what instructions look like, or at what point that candidates got instructions and things like that. So all of that happens kind of gradually, but starting out with something where if you need to scrap it all, you haven't sunk 6-8 months is something that's what I'm trying to get at with an MVP. Because if you got feedback and you're like, well, this doesn't work at all. Well, if I had already spent 6 months coding up a platform and building out my own Google Doc, I'd be 6 months out of line, right? If we were going to eventually not use a doc at all. And to the second question, I think it was like, when did we start transitioning? Remind me, what was the second question?
How thoroughly developed was Byteboard before bringing it to reality?
Yeah. Well, so like I mentioned, for our first pitch for our investor call, we had only the problem statement. We had no idea what the thing would actually look like. So we really sold them on like, we're the right people to go investigate if this works or not. And we got 6 months of funding for the first round. After the first round of 6 months, we had built a product and we had our initial pilot with Lyft underway. And we barely had any code written actually for a pilot for Lyft. It was like Nikki and I waking up in the middle of the night when a candidate was like, I'm ready to take the interview. And we'd be like, cool, here's a Google Doc, and like email them. Eventually, a little bit down the line, we like wrote a script that a candidate would tell us what time they want to take the interview, and the script would run, and then send them an email like that. Those are the levels of automation that were happening. But then sometimes candidates were in a different time zone and our script broke. Like those are the things that you learn along the way, right? And so for our initial pilot, we had the concept of the idea, and it looks very similar to like the idea that it is now in terms of what the interview format looks like. But the experience of it for a candidate has considerably changed since we initially went out to folks.
Awesome, thank you. We have a question from Isita. She's asking, how did you create, build, and foster core values for your startup? What values do you consider to be the most important?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's an exercise that we kind of often do at Byteboard. And the core values, I think there's something I learned about core values is like developing them too early is not great as well. And developing them too late is not great as well. You want to figure out what your team and what your team looks like. And two of the values that we have on our team is always be scrappy and don't forget to be a little extra. And that happened about like, we developed those values about a year in to our team, and they really speak to like how we built our product and how we built our team. We're a little bit extra always, like we just like always want a little bit of a polish. We'll always want a little bit of a flair at the end. That's just how Nikki and I operate. So that was like important for us to build into our values and really echo with our team. And then the same goes for our product of like always being scrappy is something that we wanted to keep in mind because that's what really got us through the first year. So it was a balance of both of those things. And in terms of fostering those values, it's something that it comes back to hiring as well. Like when you're hiring someone, do you feel like they echo those values and they can really be a kind of like like person that fosters and really encourages those values to grow? And so it really does depend again on building the right team that fosters those values. You can't necessarily like force those onto them. You really have to mimic them and then have the team follow.
Okay, thank you. We have time for one more question, I believe, from the chat. It's asking, when working to develop an MVP, how do you make sure that the team is, one, on the same page in terms of vision, and two, is constantly motivated by the idea that it would be of value to the market and to the end users?
Yeah, so when you're working on the MVP, it's actually just aligning on the value prop. What are you getting to, with what you're building? So with Byteboard's value prop, our core value was to create interviews that were fairly assessing for the right skills. Once we agreed on that as a team, if there was ever any idea that came up in a meeting or like, why aren't we building this? Why aren't we doing this? We would just pose this question in the meeting. Is it delivering back to our value prop right in this minute, right? Can we do without this right now and then go out and still answer this question of is our MVP answering this question? And that's really how we got to be focused on really just building for MVP initially. Eventually, then you're like, okay, I've answered this question. What's the next question I want to answer? And that's when you start to add your features and things like that. To the second part of this question of like, how do you constantly be motivated by the idea? Everyone on our team hates interviews. And so everyone I hired for our team has like gone through technical interviews or their partner has gone through technical interviews or their mom has gone through technical interviews and like they've heard about it, they've felt this, right? And that's really something like at the end of the day that keeps them motivated of like, this is gonna work. Now that we're much bigger, I was just actually like looking at some of the comments that I wasn't earlier in the invite. Like, folks have taken this and said like, this is one of my favorite interviews. Like that keeps us so motivated that we're working on the right thing and actually building something for impact. But it really comes back to understanding what the motivations of the people that you bring onto your team are, right? Is the motivation of someone on your team when you're hiring it to like work on something that's like super tech savvy, super difficult, and like just like out of this like, like really challenging problem. That might not be a good fit for someone on this team, right? And just because sometimes the work we do is like maybe not technically difficult, but has a lot of impact. And everyone on our team that we eventually ended up hiring was like, hey, I want to make an impact. And those are the people that were recruited onto our team. So it's about balancing those values, balancing those ideas really, really in the beginning when you're building out your team.
Great, thank you. And I think we do actually have time for one more question. Eunice wants to know, do you think having another person share your initial idea, like Nikki, you mentioned your co-founder of Byteboard, encouraged you to continue pursuing the startup, or was it always your intention to create a startup in that sense?
Yeah, I would say that it was never my intention to do a startup, especially when you land at somewhere like Google. The golden handcuffs, if you've heard of those, are very real. You're like, this is a sweet life, right? Like, yes, I'm working on something great, but I'm working at Google, like I could do this for the rest of my life. And so I never thought I'd go and do a startup or ever even found a startup. I thought that was a really scary idea. And it was really Nikki who convinced me. And she was like, cool, we have an idea. I'm going to go home and start a deck. And I was like, cool. Yeah, we're totally going to start a deck. And she goes home and like shares a deck with me. And I was like, oh, we're really going to do this. And like that, and like getting activated about an idea is somewhat of a weakness of mine and strength of Nikki's. And so we ended up complementing ourselves a lot. I speak to a lot of like the mental hold a startup has on you. And so in that sense, like having a partner through this all is so encouraging and so helpful. So I definitely think there are like so many lows through this sometimes where you're like, if you didn't have someone who could relate back to you, could be like, no, we got this. It's going to be the two of us at least. it makes this so much harder. Speaking generally just from personal experience.
Yeah, I definitely agree. The team dynamic is much better than like your own personal building a startup in that sense. So we've handled all the chat questions that we could for today. So I want to give it back to Seema.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sargun, for your time. We were really inspired by your journey to CEO. Now it is time for a quick, short music break before our first fireside chat for today. So thank you so much, Sargun.
Thanks, everyone.